The impeachment inquiry closed this week with testimony from officials detailing pivotal moments in the Trump administration's pressure campaign of Ukraine. Joining me tonight are four reporters who know this story, who have been covering it all week. Carol Leonnig, investigative reporter for The Washington Post. Abby Phillip, political correspondent for CNN. John Bresnahan, congressional bureau chief for Politico. And Susan Davis, congressional correspondent for NPR. Now let's catch up. Looking back at this week's critical moments, we learn more about President Trump's conduct and the evolution of what Ambassador Gordon Sondland acknowledged was a quid pro quo arrangement.
It was improper for the president to demand an investigation into a political opponent.
Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Everyone was in the loop.
I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do.
He was being involved in a domestic political errand, and we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged.
Gordon Sondland, everyone was in the loop. Carol, you've been digesting this as a reporter all week. When you look at Ambassador Sondland's testimony, what mattered? What did you learn, someone who's been covering it and knows the facts?
Ambassador Sondland, who initially tried to say in his testimony that he doesn't really remember whether or not the president was seeking an investigation of his Democratic rival, Joe Biden, on this particular day laid bare everything he thought. Looking back, piecing it all together, he knew there was a quid pro quo, and he knew it had been at the instruction of the president through his agent, Rudy Giuliani, his personal attorney. The most striking thing about what I view as Gordon Sondland's flip-flop is he finally came clean in describing this is really what it was. I didn't want to say it exactly this way, but this is what it was.
But he also seemed to try to still want to protect himself. I mean, there's a key moment in Sondland's testimony where the only thing that he disputed about David Holmes's reiteration of the call that he had with the president was that he mentioned to Holmes that Biden came up specifically. He says, I don't think that that part of it is true. And the reason why he insists on that is because he wants to claim that he didn't know that the investigation into Burisma was really an investigation into Joe Biden until the very end. That's the part that a lot of people believe strains credulity because it seems to protect Sondland. Even while he seems to admit later on he believes that it ended up being a quid pro quo. And a lot of people involved in this, as he pointed out, everybody was in the loop, seemed to know that there was an investigation into Burisma that was being demanded, but a lot of these individuals still don't want to acknowledge that they knew that that was, as Fiona Hill put it, a political errand.
One of the people challenging the credibility of that assertion was Dr. Fiona Hill. What was the power of her testimony, John, when you look at it, especially as Democrats try to use her as a way to counter what Republicans are saying?
Well, she confronted Sondland directly inside the White House, and she has this argument with her and says, you know, what you're doing is wrong, and tells him that to his face, and that was just stunning. You think about it, it's like a scene out of a movie. They're having this argument at the White House, you are breaking the law, and and then she goes and relates this all to then National Security Director John Bolton, and he says, go tell the lawyers. And he immediately sends her, because he knows that this is troubling. And that's a really hugely dramatic movie. It was like it's like something out of a movie. It was really kind of stunning.
That's a great point about the movie-type atmosphere. But it was a culture that was revealed inside of the Trump administration. And was it about President Trump himself? Did Sondland and others really reveal the president in his own involvement?
In many ways they did, and I think Fiona Hill's testimony was also really interesting because she didn't necessarily apologize to Sondland, but she did say after hearing his testimony, it was even more clear to her that he just thought he was doing his job. And she understood that in a way because she thought he was operating outside the system, and she realized he thought he was operating within the system. I think the sum total of effect of all of these testimonies this week is that, with the exception of one defense line still standing, almost every line of defense the White House has put up for either the president's decision-making or his behavior or the rationale was undermined by some element of testimony this week. No quid pro quo, it was all hearsay, it was a perfect call, he had reason to believe that there was Ukraine meddling, systematically was taken apart this week by the sum total of these witnesses.
And you know, I totally agree. You summed it up beautifully. I also think it is going to be a movie at one point because, you know, just think
Carol,
about...
we need you in the newsroom. Screenplay authors right now. Please.
But thank you. But I find this moment the most interesting on July 10th. You hit on it. Fiona Hill is sent running after Gordon Sondland by her boss, the National Security Advisor, John Bolton. Watch those guys. Watch those drug dealers. Follow them and see what they're doing. She follows them to the basement. She breaks into the room. They're with the Ukrainians. Gordon Sondland is talking about, we need you to do these investigations. You need to give the president what he wants. And she says, what you're doing is wrong. And the Ukrainians are standing there, and Sondland says, let's let the Ukrainians, you know, let's get them out of the room right now. And they're literally standing in the hallway in the basement of the White House unattended. It's unbelievable. But to your point about culture, it's about a group of people who are all like, how can I help the king get what he wants?
But Abby, you've been on the campaign trail reporting for CNN, talking to voters. When you step back and you look at the testimony, do your sources in the Democratic Party feel like this has broken through to voters on the impeachment front? And what are voters talking about when they hear this testimony?
They do not think it has broken through, not in the same way that you might expect given how dramatic it all is. The problem is that people are not following it that closely, and among Democratic voters, they care much more about policy issues than they do about what they believe they already know, which is that they already believe that President Trump is corrupt. They don't necessarily need all of this mountain of evidence in order to make that clear to them. And in fact, I was talking to a Republican pollster recently who was remarking about how stable the polling has been, how there have been so few shifts in public opinion. Democrats have solidified in believing that the president needs to be removed. Independents have only shifted a couple of points, only a few points, and Republicans have lined up behind the president. So we're in a remarkable moment in the sense that the evidence is so clear, and yet the polling shows that the electorate still is very balkanized in their political camps, and very little that's happening right now is moving them.
Any cracks in the Republican Party? You look at someone like Representative Elise Stefanik from New York. She was seen as a relatively centrist Republican,
moderate,
friendly with the leadership. She was out in front for President Trump.
She was out in front. Will Hurd, Republican from Texas. I think Will Hurd is maybe even a better example of why there's no cracks. He's retiring. He's the kind of Republican who has the freedom to maybe break with the party because he's not seeking re-election. His closing statement yesterday, he basically said, I'm a no on impeachment. And I think this is a line you're going to hear a lot from Republicans, is that he said, you know, I didn't like the way the president conducted his foreign policy. I don't think he exercised the best judgment. But there's nothing that I've seen here that I think warrants removal from office. And if you don't have Will Hurd willing to break with the party, you don't really have anyone.
I agree with you. And the Senate Republicans, they're not moving. And Trump is working very hard to keep Senate Republicans in line. He's taking them into the Oval Office. He's even meeting with Mitt Romney. You know, he's bringing Mitt Romney into the White House. A guy, you know, and they're sitting there, and you know, he's trying to be nice to everybody under Mitch McConnell's direction. Mitch McConnell said to him, a while ago, hey, you better start turning around with Senate Republicans. I think one thing also that struck me this week, though, is amazing about this whole scandal is how many people knew. There were a lot of people in Washington and Kyiv.
Mulvaney, Secretary of State,
dozens of
Mike
people,
Pompeo.
And it doesn't break out into the open until late August. And when you know there's reports on the aid being held up, and even then we didn't know right away. But I went through it. There's a couple dozen people who knew, which is just stunning to me. The atmosphere in the White House.
That's so true. So why aren't Democrats waiting to hear from Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, Ambassador John Bolton, who's been referenced in so many of these hearings? Why are they moving forward? And is the puzzle incomplete until we hear from those people?
I think the puzzle is definitely incomplete. I've had a source tell me that we are only halfway through this game in terms of knowing everything that happened. What's missing? Mulvaney, Bolton, Pompeo. Pompeo may leave office before we get any answers from him. But the truth of the matter is, guys, those people are not going to testify unless a court tells them to. It's not going to happen. And you can see why Chairman Schiff wants to move forward, get the articles, get the vote, move forward. Doesn't feel like he really needs their testimony yet. It could come in the Senate trial, though.